I'm Elizabeth Schreiber-Byers, Events Liaison for Library Services at the library, and I'm excited to be moderating this panel of Library of Congress staff on their books and research. The librarian often says that the real treasures of the library are the people who work at the collections and who bring them to life for visitors. And today I'm delighted to be able to talk to 4 of those staff members. So before getting into your books, why don't you tell us a little bit about your roles at the library? So I guess we'll start on this end.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Trevor Owens. I'm the Director of Digital Services, and working mostly on various parts of digital infrastructure, digitization, crowdsourcing projects. We do collect from archive websites, any number of things in support of many of the other divisions in the Library of Congress. And so that's a little bit about me, and you want to go next?
Sure, I'm Julie Miller. I'm in charge of early American collections in the manuscript division at the Library of Congress. So some of these collections, you've heard of the papers of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. They're very heavily used. But we also have papers of more ordinary people. And one collection I like a lot that we recently digitized is the records of East Florida. So in East Florida, this is Spanish East Florida, between the Revolutionary War and 1821 when the United States took it over. And the government got the records at the same time as the state. And it includes records of, among other people, it includes declarations of status of people who escaped from slavery in places like South Carolina and Georgia. So what they did in these declarations of status is they said, this is who I am, this is where I came from, this is how I got here. You just heard Ahmed Johnson speaking about genealogical African-American genealogy. There's also, in addition to genealogical records, there's also records in all kinds of collections in the manuscript division and at the library.
I'm Ryan Reft. I'm Julie's colleague in the manuscript division. I'm a historian also. I oversee our 20th and 21st century collections pertaining to domestic policy and politics, SCOTUS, federal judges, Congress, LGBTQ, labor history, those sorts of subjects. I'm also a co-editor of the manuscript division blog, Unfolding History, where you can read Julie and others talk about our collections and the history that relates to them.
Hi, I'm Mark Harwitz. I'm a music specialist in the music division. My specialty is Broadway musical theater. I acquire collections for the library, the papers of composers, lyricists, librettists. I process those collections. I do reference. I produce concerts. And it's remarkable what we have among the collections. I've been the archivist curator for our Richard Rogers, Leonard Bernstein, Cole Porter. So take advantage of what we've got. It's pretty extraordinary.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves. Now, so we've heard about your roles. Let's hear a little bit about the research that you have published. These are in a specific order, so I'm going to call on you. So Julie, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So my first book really had nothing whatsoever to do with what I do at the library today. It's called Abandoned: Foundlings in 19th Century New York City, and it was published in 2008 before I came to the library. And it's about an epidemic of infant abandonment in the middle of the 19th century in New York City, and it was about the way the city attempted to deal with the problem using models, following models from European cities. And most women who abandoned babies, and most people who abandoned babies were poor, unmarried women who worked as domestic servants. And the problem of infant abandonment only subsided in the early 20th century when employment opportunities opened up for women. So it was directly tied to the limitations on women's lives and work. I began my second book, which has a very lurid title. I don't know if you could see the titles there. Yeah, the title is Cry of Murder on Broadway, A Woman's Ruin and Revenge in Old New York. It doesn't sound like the sort of thing a librarian would write, but what can I say? And I started that with a fellowship from the New York Historical Society again before I came to the library. And that one is about a woman called Amelia Norman, who's very much like the subjects of my first book. Like them, she was a domestic servant and a single mother, and the father of her child abandoned her and the baby. And in 1843, she followed him up the steps of the city's fanciest, biggest, and newest hotel, the Astor House, and she stabbed him. But he lived, she didn't kill him, and there was a trial, And in the trial, she was acquitted. And what was happening was there was an economic depression at the time in the 1840s that followed a downturn called the Panic of 1837. And there was tremendous sympathy for the plight of a poor woman, so she was acquitted. And I came ultimately to feel that her violence was an expression of the same anger that you see in the women who pretty soon after this founded the movement for women's rights, but they had the ability to write and speak, so they didn't go around stabbing people with knives. They had other tools. And we have, in the manuscript division, we have the papers of some of those early participants, leaders of the movement for women's rights, like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Thank you, Julie. Mark, you're up next.
Hi, I've had 2 books through the library. The first one is Sondheim on Music, which is in its 3rd edition now. And that actually grew out of a grant proposal I got through the library to do interviews with Sondheim in anticipations of his papers coming to the library. And it was a fairly in-depth study of his manuscripts and asking him questions while looking at his manuscripts. And it was videotaped, and the idea it would just be available for researchers when they came to the library. But after I got back from the interviews, I transcribed them, and people started seeing them and said, you know, those would make a great book. So that's how the book happened. It was not intended to be a book, but it was. And the most recent one, The Letters of Oscar Hammerstein II, came out 2 months ago, and they've just authorized its 3rd printing. And we have in the music division Oscar Hammerstein's papers. The great thing about his collection is he not only kept the correspondence he received, but carbons of his outgoing letters, so you get the conversations between people. And there are also other collections in the library in the manuscript division that have letters from Oscar. The Josh Logan papers and the Ruben Mamoulian papers are there. So there you have it.
Thank you, Mark. Trevor.
Sure. So I'm sort of the odd one out of the mix in a way, but I think it's kind of nice to show the different ranges of things that people write about and publish on who work at the Library of Congress. And so in each of your cases, you sort of have a historical focus that relates in some ways to the collections. And my 2 books that I've got up here are more sort of technical and also relate to sort of how certain things around preservation happen. So one book is The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation. That's my most recent book. I teach digital preservation to library school students and felt like there wasn't enough information about how and why ensuring long-term access to digital information is important and how it relates to preserving any number of other kinds of materials. And so the book really explores that and gets into a lot of things. Interestingly, library collections do come up in it in a few cases, in part because they're really vivid examples of how and what it takes to ensure, somebody's WordPerfect documents are going to be available in the future for us to be able to work with, or WordStar documents, really, that a lot of work in the manuscript division and music division now is increasingly focusing on those kinds of born digital collections. And so my book is sort of on the technical and procedural parts of that. And then my other book about online communities grew out of my dissertation research, which is in educational technology, looking at how online forums structure discussion and discourse, but interestingly also relates to the future of digital records. So, when we look to the future, one of the areas that teams in digital services work on is web archiving. And so preserving things like online forums is really interesting, but they present really different kinds of primary source records that are going to be the basis of history going forward. And so that book is very much technically about what we need to know and understand about how those systems were designed so that we can interpret them in the best way in the future. So that's some background on some of my writing.
Great. And last but not least, Brian.
Both my projects grew out of some digital work I was doing at the time. East of East, the Baking of Greater Almonte, I co-founded a website with a friend of mine, Alex Saif Cummings, somewhere around 2010, 2011. And in that process, we kind of became a clearinghouse for a lot of academics trying to bridge between their academic work and popular culture. And we kind of came in contact with these folks who were doing work in San Gabriel Valley, a suburb of El Monte and South El Monte, the South El Monte Arts Posse led by Carrie Fregosa and Romeo Guzman, and they were trying to build an archive about the history of the city because this city had gone from being a white, blue-collar and middle-class suburb to being Latino and Asian, much like the San Gabriel Valley suburbs more broadly, and they wanted to tell the entire town's history because it had sold itself in a different way. And so we put that project together, got picked up by KCT in California, where I was writing for at the time, and it eventually became a book later. The more projects coming out in January, Justice in the Interstates, The Racist Truth About Urban Highways, developed also out of, I'm the co-editor of the Urban History Association's blog, The Metropole, and we had some folks come to us to talk about a theme month on kind of using a reconciliation approach to highway construction, which really kind of overburdened a lot of working class, particularly working class communities, Black and Latino communities across the US. The theme month went really well, and the Island Press, which is actually a press in the city, contacted us about expanding it and doing it at a volume, and that's how that came to be. So both those things kind of emerged from those processes.
Great. So, Trevor, you've talked about how your role specifically relates to the books that you've written, and Mark, the collections that you have been processing and been responsible for, how they kind of fed directly into these books. I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about how the way that our roles and research at the library kind of intersect, and how these books relate to the roles and the collections that you're responsible for, especially like Ryan and Julie, who did their research prior to coming to the library, and then maybe also gesture a little bit toward the future of what possible books you have on the horizon, or research interests that are coming out of the work that you're doing at the library. So anybody can start.
Well, one thing about the Oscar Hammerstein, it's a huge book. It's 1,088 pages, but it's about 1,000 letters. And I actually, in over a year's period, I transcribed 4,600 letters from the Hammerstein collection. And the goal is to actually do a website in the library with scans of all of those letters along with the transcriptions, because what I put in the book are the things that most directly related to Oscar, but the collection itself is so much richer and a source of research for other topics that people would never think to look in the Hammerstein collection for. An example is he was invited to become a member of the Society for the Prevention of Jim Crow in Baseball. I didn't know such a society existed, and somebody interested in that topic would never think to go into the Oscar Hammerstein collection to find it. And that's one of the things that excited me about this project is when you process a collection and when you start working with it, you realize all the hidden treasures, and it's not always easy to get them out to the public and make them aware. So this was my opportunity to do that. So I think that answers your question.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. I think it informs my work at the library in a couple ways. So for the book that's forthcoming in January, Justice in the Interstates, we tried to talk to an author about writing a chapter on Overton Park in Memphis, which is more or less about environmental policy. That conversation didn't go very well, and we realized, well, we have the papers of the SCOTUS Justice, the rule in that case, you could probably just write it. So I went on a long overseas vacation and wrote most of it on the airplane when we got back. And what was useful about that was I didn't actually know much about environmental history in terms of the law. And within a couple of months, I was actually advising some researchers on that policy based on the research I had done for that chapter. So that was like a very direct one-to-one correlation. But I would also argue that, Julie writes for a lot of blogs. I write for a lot of blogs outside the library in addition to writing for the library. And you read a lot of books and other secondary materials and other sources when you do that, and it does expand your knowledge just more generally. And maybe more so for me than Julie, because all her people are dead, and I'm actually going after people who actually live and breathe. When you go to look at a collection, when you're thinking about where a collection fits historically or if it's important or relevant, swimming in those waters helps you navigate those decisions a little bit better. And it's sort of ineffable, but it definitely does have an influential impact on what I do at the library. So I do think that all that, it's hard to put a quantitative value to it, but qualitatively, I do think it makes us better historians.
The dead sort of hold still, so it's easier to get a grip on them. I find. So my scope at the library, which is early America, is really different from the subjects of my books, but the background that I brought to my work at the library has very much affected the work that I do there. So I'm very much interested in the lives of women and also the lives of ordinary people. And as a result of this, I've worked on a couple of projects that have attempted to use the George Washington papers to find out about ordinary people. So a project that Trevor works on, By the People, which is a transcription project, we used George Washington's farm reports. We had George Washington's farm reports transcribed. And as a result of that, we learned all about the enslaved people who worked at Mount Vernon, the work they did, births of children, for example. It was really very interesting. We also had a little group of interrogations of British deserters during the Revolutionary War, each of whom told their story, and they ended up being little capsule biographies of these, a wide group of loyalists, escapees from the, people who'd been captured by the British Army, soldiers and sailors. So they're very, very interesting. So, but one of the things that I'm doing now is in George Washington's papers, there's a whole bunch of letters and diary entries concerning a woman, a widow, who was Washington's neighbor named Penelope French. And she had a piece of land that Washington wanted to buy, and she refused to sell it to him, and she held out for years. So it's a very, very interesting story. And what I discovered is that even though she never wrote a letter herself, she delegated the negotiations to her son-in-law and her brother. The best record of her life is in George Washington's papers. So it just shows how George Washington's papers, which have been very carefully maintained over the entire course of their existence, first by Washington and then by the federal government and then by the library. So they're like considered sort of the crown jewels of the Library of Congress. But because they've been so carefully maintained and published and transcribed and so on, there's a lot in there about the people who surrounded him whose lives aren't otherwise documented. So they're a very useful resource in that way.
Sure, and for me, I think one of the things that I love the most about librarianship is it's both, and archival practices, it's both, you're working on making knowledge and resources accessible to people, but part of that is also, there's a space there for scholarship about how to do that better and improve on it. And so we get to sort of, I think in the best of worlds, we can participate in both of those things and sort of, I think it comes through in some of all of your comments too, right? The writing projects that we take on, our work within publishing is also relevant to understanding the users of the library's collections too, and sort of the ways we can make connections with them. And so most of there's some of my writing is tied to teaching things or outside of work, but there's a lot of other writing that is sort of connecting with others in the library spaces, people that do library and information science research. And then in terms of future projects, I'm close to finishing a book with University of Michigan Press. It's called After Disruption, A Future for Cultural Memory. That's broadly about the future of libraries and archives, and also has some sort of memoir characteristics to it from my own experience, working on digital technology in different organizations.
Great. Thank you all so much. Any other future projects? I know Julie talked about Penelope French. Your book is coming out shortly. And
there's the Broadway orchestrator of most of the Sondheim shows named Jonathan Tunick. He's asked me to help him with his memoirs. So for the last year and a half, every Sunday afternoon, we do about an hour-and-a-half interview, and I transcribe it, and we're working on, and he's also promised us his collection too, so it does relate to the library. So
lovely.
That's my next project.
Great. So I don't want to monopolize all the time, and I would like to open it up to any questions that you might have for the staff about their roles, the collections for which they're responsible, the research that they do, anything at all. The microphones are up here and kind of back halfway down.
Quite fascinating. I'm a huge fan of the library, and I've had very good experiences researching there. I'm seeing that you have these broad experiences outside the institution and within the library. What is your process in terms of looking at the collections and saying, aha, I think I've got something here that I think will resonate with the public? Is there anything, any special magic that has occurred to you in any of your books?
I mean, almost daily I get excited by things that I discover and fall upon. I don't know if this is exactly the answer you're looking for, but one of my favorite things is working with researchers, and I've developed close ties with a lot of them. So one of the fun things to do is when you discover something that you know will be of interest to a researcher, I email that researcher and say, guess what we just got, or guess what I just found. You have to come and look at it. And that's very gratifying. And, you know, I wish there was a way to do it more broadly. But every day is an aha moment for me.
You know, go ahead, Julie.
I was just going to say, I'm in charge of something like 3,000 collections, so clearly I can't be intimate with every single one of them. But I find what happens is that the researchers lead me through the collections. In other words, when a researcher has a question about their own research, I have to then find out about that collection. As far as what I'm interested in, it's impossible to say. I mean, I think, you know, it's just your own interests are mysterious, basically.
I would just say that, so I've been writing for and editing blogs for over a decade. And sometimes you think something is gonna just hit and explode, and it does nothing. And then something you think is trash just kills. And you're just like, there's no logic in this world. But a lot of times, like for example, Julie wrote a really good piece, not trash at all. But she's written a couple of good pieces for us, and she's got one that's just been destroying for months. And you know, we know why to some extent, but it's also just serendipity too.
No, it has a quote in the title.
As a quote, it's also well written. I'm not, yeah. A Republic, if you can keep it, go look at it. It's great. But in terms of collections, you know, all the time I'll acquire something, and I'll acquire it because there's something in there like that I thought was exciting, and it might have been for somebody, but then somebody will find something else about it, and that's what ends up being big. Like we acquired the papers of L. Patrick Ray, who was the acting director of the FBI during Watergate for a year before he got kind of booted. And we acquired it partially for the Watergate stuff, but I acquired it because there's like AIM movement stuff in there that we just didn't have. But then someone came in and like looked at all the FBI stuff and said, this is amazing, it shouldn't even be here. And I was like, well, it is, too late, you know. But the point is that he found value in it where that flew over my head. And so I guess it's tricky trying to predict those things. You know it when you know it, but sometimes the thing you know isn't the reason it's like popular later, if that makes any sense.
And for me, a lot of my writing has grown out of my teaching practice and trying to work with students who want to work in libraries and think about the future of their work. And so the digital preservation book, in part, it took me a long time to get up to, when I started thinking about digital preservation, it was very confusing to me. There was so many different kind of very technical things. And so in teaching a course on digital preservation, I kind of came up with a different framework that I thought would work better. And then building from teaching the class, I made the book as part of that.
Hello. Ooh, very close. I'm a library school student, and I'm very interested in learning more about if any of you can provide any insight into how you got to where you are, and also as a sort of, subsection of that question, how did you find your niche?
Well, I actually taught high school history in New York City for about 10 years in the public schools. And then got a PhD, and then lucked into the fact there was a position at the library. But in that in-between time, I did a lot of writing for blogs, like I discussed, and just did as much work in public history as possible at every chance I got. And when the job came up, I was lucky enough to get consideration for it. But I think for library science stuff, Trevor and Mark may have more. And Julie, actually, don't you have like a
I have a
background
library
in that too?
degree.
Yeah.
Am I the only one who has a library degree of this group? I may be. I mean, I have a library degree. I was a librarian and archivist, and then I got a doctorate in history. So, by the time I came to the Library of Congress, I had a lot of years of experience, both in teaching college and also working in archives. So I was pretty old by the time I came here. So I'd done all those things. But I think you just have to pursue what interests you, really.
Well, I would say that check out the Junior Fellows program that the Library of Congress has too, which is an amazing opportunity, and the fellows work on fantastic work every year. So that's a really great opportunity.
The AHA Fellowship also is good.
Yeah, so there's an internships and fellowships program at the Library of Congress that has information about those opportunities. In terms of finding a niche, I've always been really interested in digital technology and information, and sort of ended up getting into this via work in a history organization that focused on digital technology for history. But I work a lot with students that in American University that are interested in public history, and then library school students at the University of Maryland. And I think the best way to learn more about different roles in libraries is to just find people doing something interesting and see if you can send them an email or reach out to them. I think almost all of us and many of our colleagues are people who are always excited to talk to people about careers in libraries and help navigate the kind of space. So I think there's a good chance that if you reach out to someone and have some context on their work, they'd be really excited to talk to you about the kind of work that they do.
I came as the niche. I've been at the library for 30 years, and when they hired me, I had no library background. They were looking for somebody with a specialty in American musical theater because there were so many collections. And they would never hire me today, I think, because I don't have a library degree. But my advice, which has stood me in extraordinary stead, I've had the luckiest career at the library, is I keep proposing projects that I want to do, and somehow I get to do them. And I just find a lot of my colleagues are not proactive that way, but those who are, it has served me in good stead. So that's my best advice to you is come up with projects you want to do and then propose doing them.
Yeah, I would just, to Mark's point, a lot of institutions, and this isn't unique to the library at all, it's just institutional, tend to be reactive. So if you can get into a position, like Mark's saying, where you see something and can be proactive, they tend to appreciate that and they'll give you a shot.
If we have time for one more question.
Do you train or help authors to do research? Like, if someone comes to you with a question, do you point them to collections and?
That's what we mainly do. Yeah, that's what we do. In other words, part of our function really is to be reference librarians. So, really every day I do that. So people either come in or they email. And of course, during the pandemic, it became totally email and some video, actually. So that's really the core of what most of us do.
And on that front, it's worth underscoring that Ask a Librarian is a service of the Library of Congress where you can you don't need to know who the right person is to reach out to. You can ask a question and it gets routed to the right expert to help identify what materials you could work with and connect with.
I was just going to end with that. If you do have questions for any of the librarians, ask.loc.gov is the Ask a Librarian portal, and you can select from any number of subjects, and it will go directly to a librarian who can answer your question. So thank you all for being here today, and thank you to our panelists. I hope you enjoy the rest of the book festival.